The first thing anyone thought, standing in front of that open tomb, was not that he had risen. It was that somebody had stolen the body. That is the reaction the Gospels record. Not joy, not recognition, not even hope. A woman running back through the dark to say, "They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him." And the second thing worth knowing before we start is who was standing there: women. In 1st century Judea, a woman's testimony carried little or no weight in a court. Josephus says plainly that it should not be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. It was a legal disadvantage, everybody understood. So, if you were constructing a story to persuade a skeptical 1st century audience, you would not have women find the tomb. You would have Peter find it, or John, or a Roman soldier, somebody whose word would stand up. Every gospel puts women there first. This is the story of that morning, and of a set of small, awkward, unhelpful details that are very difficult to explain as invention, because no one constructing a case for a skeptical audience would ever have chosen to include them. Start with the burial, because the burial is why anybody was there at all. Jesus died on a Friday afternoon, and the Sabbath began at sunset. That gave them a few hours. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, asked Pilate for the body, which took nerve, since he was requesting the corpse of a man executed for sedition and identifying himself as a sympathizer in the process. Nicodemus came with him, bringing a very large quantity of myrrh and aloes. They wrapped the body and laid it in a new tomb cut out of rock and rolled a stone across the entrance. And then they had to stop because the sun was going down. That is the crucial thing. The burial was interrupted. It was done properly enough to be respectful and not properly enough to be finished, and everybody involved knew it. Which is why, the moment the Sabbath ended, women who had watched where he was laid came back with spices to complete what Friday had not allowed. They are not going to a resurrection. They are going to a body. That is the entire content of their expectation, and it is written into the fact that they brought ointment. Mark gives us their conversation on the way, and it is wonderfully ordinary. And they said among themselves, "Who shall roll us away the stone from the door of the sepulchre?" They have thought about the spices, the timing, the walk in the half-dark. They have not solved the actual problem. A blocking stone for a rock-cut tomb was a disc of limestone that could weigh a ton or more, set in a channel so that it rolled downhill into place, easy to close, extremely hard to open, and deliberately so. 3 women at dawn, discussing a stone they cannot possibly move, walking towards it anyway. Matthew adds something the others do not, that the chief priests had asked Pilate for a guard, because they remembered that Jesus had said he would rise after 3 days, and they wanted the tomb secured against his disciples stealing the body. Pilate gave them a watch, and the stone was sealed. Whatever you make of that detail, notice what it concedes. The authorities expected a stolen body claim. They took steps against it in advance. It is a piece of evidence that the resurrection story was anticipated by its opponents before there was anything to oppose. And then the women arrive, and the stone is already gone. Now watch what happens next, because it is not what a triumphant ending looks like. Mary Magdalene does not investigate. She does not look inside. She turns and runs, and what she says when she reaches Peter and John is an accusation of theft. They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him. They, somebody. Grave robbery was common enough that the assumption was reasonable, and there is even an imperial inscription, the so-called Nazareth Decree, threatening capital punishment for disturbing tombs, which some have connected to exactly this kind of trouble. Her mind goes to the ordinary explanation immediately and without difficulty. That is what makes her a good witness. She is not primed for a miracle. Then comes the foot race, and John, writing decades later, still cannot resist telling you who won. So they ran both together, and the other disciple did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre. It is such a human sentence. An old man recording the most significant morning in human history and quietly noting that he was faster. But he stops at the entrance. He stoops down, looks in, sees the linen clothes lying, and does not go in. Peter, characteristically, arrives second and walks straight past him into the tomb. And what they find inside is the strangest evidence in the whole account. Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. The grave clothes are still there, and they are not thrown about. Think about what theft looks like. If you are stealing a body at night against a guard at risk of execution, you take the body as it lies. You do not stop in a dark tomb to unwrap a corpse coated in something like 100 pounds weight of myrrh and aloes, a substance that sets over time into a solid mass around the linen. You would need tools and hours, and you would be carrying away the one thing that made the body identifiable while leaving behind the expensive burial cloth. And the head cloth is described with strange care, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself, folded or rolled and set apart. Whatever happened in that tomb, it was not hurried, and nobody was panicking. And John says, "Then went in also that other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed." Believed what exactly? The next verse is careful, for as yet they knew not the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. He believed before he understood. He looked at how the cloths were lying and concluded something the scriptures had not yet explained to him. Then the two of them go home. That is the actual next verse. They went away again unto their own home, which is such an anticlimax that it reads as reported rather than composed. But Mary stays. Mary stood without at the sepulchre weeping. Everyone else has come, looked, and left. She has nowhere to go because she is not there to verify a claim. She is there because the body of someone she loved has been taken, and she does not know where. And she stoops down and looks in, and there are two angels sitting where the body had been, one at the head and one at the feet. Now, if you have any expectation of how such a scene should go, this is where it collapses. She is not frightened. She does not fall down. She answers their question like someone too exhausted to be astonished. "Woman, why weepest thou?" "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him." That is the third time she has said the same sentence. Grief has reduced her to one idea, and she repeats it to disciples, to angels, and in a moment, to a man she assumes is the gardener. She turns round, and Jesus is standing there, and she does not recognize him. That is not a small detail either, and it happens more than once that week. The pair on the road to Emmaus walk and talk with him for hours without knowing him. The accounts are oddly insistent that the risen Jesus was not immediately recognizable. which is a strange thing to invent if your purpose is to make the story convincing. Supposing him to be the gardener, she says, "Sir, if thou have borne him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away." Consider what she is offering. She believes she is speaking to a workman who has moved a body. She is a woman, alone, at dawn, proposing to carry a grown man's corpse away by herself. It is not a practical plan. It is what love says when it has run out of options. And then he says one word. Jesus saith unto her, Mary. Her name, not an explanation, not a proof, not a display, just her name, and she knows him instantly. She turned herself and saith unto him, Rabboni, which is to say, Master. John leaves the word in Aramaic, Rabboni. He is quoting what she actually said, in the language she said it in, which is what people do when they are reporting rather than composing. And then the instruction that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years. Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. The older translation makes it sound like a rebuff, and it almost certainly is not. The Greek is closer to stop clinging to me, or do not go on holding me, a present imperative about an action already in progress. She has taken hold of him and is not letting go, which is the most understandable reaction in the Gospels. And the reason he gives is not that she is unworthy or unclean. It is that there is something she has to do first, and holding on will keep her from it. Go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Note what he calls them. My brethren of the men who had run from the garden, and in one case, denied knowing him 3 times in a courtyard, not my disciples, not my followers, brothers. So Mary Magdalene becomes the first person to be sent with the news. Every account of the resurrection that has ever been preached descends, at some remove, from a woman running back into Jerusalem to tell 11 frightened men that she had seen him. And here is where the legal point becomes unavoidable. In a culture where a woman's testimony was treated as unreliable in court, this is the last narrative choice a fabricator would make. It hands the opposition their argument for free. Celsus, writing against Christianity in the 2nd century, does exactly what you would expect and dismisses the whole thing on the grounds that it rests on a hysterical female. If the church had invented the story, it had every incentive to put Peter at the tomb first, and no incentive at all to put Mary there. It is what historians sometimes call an embarrassing detail, the sort of thing a tradition preserves not because it helps, but because it is what happened, and everybody already knew it. And the disciples' own reaction is preserved with the same lack of flattery. Luke and their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. The word Luke uses is a medical one. It appears in ancient physicians writing for the ravings of the delirious. The first Christians did not believe the first Christian sermon. 11 men who had spent 3 years being told this would happen heard the news and concluded the women were talking nonsense. That is not the reaction of a group primed to see what they wanted to see. It is the reaction of people who had watched a public execution and drawn the obvious conclusion from it. Then there is Matthew's account of what happened to the guard, which is the most quietly devastating passage of the 4. The soldiers go into the city and report to the chief priests. The priests take counsel, give them a large sum of money, and instruct them. Say ye, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. Look at the shape of that explanation. It requires the guards to testify to something that happened while they were unconscious. It is the only story available to people who cannot produce a body, and it concedes everything that matters, that the tomb was empty and that nobody could account for it. Matthew adds that the story was still circulating when he wrote. He is not reporting a rumor. He is answering the standing counter-explanation of his own day. And what he is effectively saying is, yes, that is what they say, and here is why they had to say it. Which brings us to the honest limit of all of this. An empty tomb by itself proves nothing. Bodies go missing. Every one of the natural explanations, theft, the wrong tomb, an unfinished burial, a plot, was available to the people standing there, and at least one of them was the first thing Mary Magdalene thought of. The empty tomb is not the claim. It is a problem that requires a claim. And it is worth being clear that the earliest opponents never disputed it. That is the striking thing about the counter-story Matthew records. The authorities did not say the tomb was occupied, or produce the body, or point anybody towards it, which would have ended the movement in an afternoon and cost them nothing. They said the disciples took him. An argument about who emptied the tomb is an argument that concedes the tomb was empty. The dispute in the first century was never about the fact. It was about the explanation. That is a narrower disagreement than most people assume, and it is the ground on which everything since has been argued. What turned it into something the early church would die for was not the absence in the tomb but the appearances. To Mary, to Peter, to the 2 walking to Emmaus, to the 11 in a locked room, to Thomas 8 days later, and Paul says, writing within a couple of decades, to over 500 at once, most of whom were still alive and could be asked. That last detail is an invitation to check. It is the sort of thing you write when you expect to be tested, not when you hope not to be. The appearances are worth walking through, because each one has a detail that is hard to account for as invention. Start with the road to Emmaus, which is the longest and the oddest. 2 followers, one named Cleopas, one not named at all, are walking the 7 miles out of Jerusalem on the Sunday afternoon, and a stranger falls into step with them. Luke says their eyes were holden that they should not know him, and they talk for hours. He asks what they are discussing, and they stop, sad, and one of them says a line that ought to be famous. Art thou only a stranger in Jerusalem, and hast not known the things which are come to pass there in these days? Then they explain the crucifixion to Jesus. And what they say is a small masterpiece of disappointed hope, but we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel. Past tense, we trusted. They are describing a belief they used to hold. They even report the empty tomb. The women went, found it empty, saw a vision of angels, and then add, but him they saw not. The evidence has reached them, and it has not moved them. If anything, it has made things worse. Now the body is missing as well. He walks with them all afternoon and explains the scriptures, and they still do not know him. And at the table, when he takes bread and blesses it and breaks it, their eyes are opened and he vanishes. Then the detail that gives the whole scene away as memory rather than construction. They say to each other, did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us by the way? It is the sentence of people reinterpreting an afternoon after the fact. Nobody inventing a resurrection appearance writes the recognition as retrospective. They walk the 7 miles back to Jerusalem that same night, after dark, on a road nobody traveled after dark, because some news cannot wait until morning. Then the locked room. John dates it to the evening of the same day and specifies why the doors were shut, for fear of the Jews. These are men expecting arrest. The movement's leader has been executed as a rebel, and the reasonable assumption is that they are next. Jesus comes and stands in the middle of them and says, "Peace be unto you." And then he shows them his hands and his side. That is a strange gesture, unless you take seriously what it implies, that the body standing in the room was continuous with the body that had been nailed to the cross. Not a spirit, not a vision, not a replacement. The wounds are the proof of identity, and they are still there. Luke's version is blunter still. He says they were terrified and supposed they had seen a spirit, and he answers by inviting them to handle him. "A spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have," and then asks whether they have anything to eat, and eats a piece of broiled fish in front of them. Whatever that is, it is not the language of a group inventing a spiritual metaphor. It is oddly, insistently physical, and it is the sort of thing that would embarrass a later theologian rather than help him. Then Thomas, who was not there. The others tell him, and he refuses them flatly. "Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." He gets called Doubting Thomas for it, which is unfair. He is asking for exactly what the other 10 had already been given. They were shown the hands and the side on the Sunday evening. He is not demanding special treatment. He is declining to accept second-hand what they accepted first-hand. 8 days later, Jesus comes again, and the first thing he does is offer Thomas precisely the test he asked for. "Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands." There is no rebuke in it. The nearest thing to a reproach comes afterwards, and it is aimed past Thomas at everybody who would come later. "Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed." And John records Thomas's answer, which is the highest thing anyone says about Jesus anywhere in the Gospel: "My Lord and my God." Then there is Peter, and this is the one I find hardest to read. He had denied knowing Jesus 3 times in a courtyard to a servant girl and 2 bystanders while the trial went on inside. Nothing in the resurrection accounts undoes that. He runs to the tomb, he sees the cloths, he goes home. The repair happens later, on a beach in Galilee, over breakfast. Jesus asks him 3 times whether he loves him, once for each denial, and Peter, grieved by the third asking, says, "Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee." And each time the answer is a job. "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep." He is not forgiven and then set aside. He is forgiven and put back to work. Finally, the piece of evidence that sits outside the Gospels altogether and is older than all of them. Paul, writing to Corinth in the mid-50s, quotes what he calls something he received and delivered, the technical vocabulary for handing on a fixed formula. It lists the death, the burial, the resurrection on the 3rd day, and then the appearances. To Peter, to the 12, to over 500 at once, to James, and last to Paul himself. Most scholars, including skeptical ones, date that formula to within a very few years of the crucifixion. Some put it inside 5. Which means the claim was not a legend that grew over generations. It was circulating as a fixed creed, while the people named in it were still alive and reachable. And Paul adds the line that no fabricator writes, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some are fallen asleep. Most of the 500 are still living. The implication is unmistakable. Go and ask them. Before the explanations, one thing that trips a lot of careful readers, and it is worth clearing up because it looks like a contradiction and is not. Jesus said he would rise on the third day, and in one place, quoting Jonah, he says 3 days and 3 nights. But he died on Friday afternoon, and the tomb was empty by Sunday at dawn. That is not 72 hours. It is barely 36. The answer is that ancient Jewish reckoning counted inclusively. Any part of a day counted as a day. Friday afternoon is day 1, Saturday is day 2, Sunday morning is day 3. The rabbinic sources are explicit that a part of a day is reckoned as the whole. Nobody in the 1st century would have read 3 days as a stopwatch measurement, any more than we read a fortnight as exactly 336 hours. And the Jonah reference is doing something else anyway. Jesus does not offer it as a schedule. He offers it as the only sign this generation will get. As Jonah's was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. It is worth sitting with what a strange thing that is to say in advance. Jonah's story is a man swallowed by the sea, given up for dead, and returned, and then sent to preach to the people he least wanted saved. Jesus takes that as the pattern and applies it to himself, publicly, before any of it happens, in front of people who would remember the claim and be able to test it. Which is precisely why the chief priests requested a guard. Matthew says so directly, "Sir, we remember that deceiver said, while he was yet alive, 'After 3 days I will rise again.'" They had heard the prediction. They took it seriously enough to spend political capital, asking a Roman governor for soldiers over a dead man. The prediction is not a later addition read backwards into the story. It is attested by the actions of the people trying to prevent its fulfillment. It is worth taking the natural explanations seriously, one at a time, because the early opponents of Christianity took them seriously, and so should we. The body was stolen. This is the oldest counter-explanation, and the one Matthew records the authorities paying for. The difficulty is not the stone or the guard. It is the grave clothes and the aftermath. Thieves take the body as it lies. They do not unwrap a corpse set into 100 pounds of aromatic resin and leave the linen behind, folded. And a stolen body produces a group of men who know the truth. It does not produce a group of men who spend the rest of their lives being flogged, imprisoned, and executed for a claim they personally know to be false. People die for things they wrongly believe true all the time. They do not generally die for things they know they made up. They went to the wrong tomb. The women had watched the burial specifically. Mark says Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of Joses, beheld where he was laid. And even granting a mistake at dawn, the correction is trivially available. Joseph of Arimathea owned the tomb. The authorities had every motive to produce the body, and Jerusalem is not large. A misidentified tomb is an error that survives about a day. He did not really die. The swoon theory asks a man to survive a Roman flogging and 6 hours of crucifixion, be certified dead by a professional execution squad, be sealed in a tomb without medical care for a day and a half, free himself from the wrappings, move a blocking stone from the inside, walk past a guard, and then present himself to his followers, in a condition convincing enough that they concluded he had conquered death rather than that he urgently needed a doctor. It was a hallucination. This is the most serious of the four, and it fails on distribution. Hallucinations are private events. They do not occur to individuals and groups, indoors and outdoors, at meals and on roads, to believers and to skeptics like Thomas and hostile outsiders like James and Paul, over a period of weeks, in a form that includes eating fish and being touched. And a hallucination leaves the tomb occupied. It explains an experience. It does not explain an absence. None of that constitutes proof, and I would be suspicious of anyone claiming it does. What it does show is that the ordinary explanations are not free. Each one costs something, and the cost is usually paid by ignoring a detail the accounts were careful to include. Then there is the change in the people themselves, which is the piece of evidence that does not depend on any text being accurate about a stone. On the Friday, the movement was finished. The leader had been executed publicly in the manor Rome reserved for rebels and slaves, which in that culture was not merely a death but a verdict. A crucified Messiah was a contradiction in terms, a demonstration that God had not backed him. The followers ran. The senior one denied knowing him to a servant. On the Sunday morning, they were behind locked doors. Within a few weeks, the same men were standing in public in the same city, the one place where the claim was easiest to disprove and most dangerous to make, announcing that the man the authorities had executed 6 weeks earlier was alive. They kept saying it under arrest, under flogging, and in most of the traditions, under execution. Something happened between the locked room and the public square, and whatever it was had to be strong enough to reverse the meaning of a crucifixion, which is the single hardest thing that first-century Judaism had to accommodate. There is also the small matter of the day. Jewish practice had rested on the seventh day for centuries. It is written into the creation account and into the law, and it was among the most defining markers of the people. Within a generation, a movement made entirely of Jews had shifted its gathering to the first day of the week and called it the Lord's Day. That is not the sort of habit that drifts. It is the sort of thing that changes when something happened on a particular morning that people could not stop marking. So what do we do with that morning? The first thing is to notice that nobody in it behaves like a believer. The women bring spices for a corpse. Mary assumes theft twice and is unmoved by angels. Peter and John look and go home. The 11 dismiss the report as raving. Thomas refuses the testimony of 10 friends. There is no credulity anywhere in the account. Every single person in it starts from the ordinary explanation and has to be moved off it. The second is the grave clothes, which I keep returning to, not disturbed, not taken. The headcloth folded and set apart in its own place, in a tomb nobody had any reason to tidy. And the third is a woman standing in a garden, offering to carry a body she could not possibly lift, being asked why she was crying, and answering the question wrong 3 times until somebody said her name. That is how the most consequential news in the history of the world was first delivered. Not with an argument, not with a proof, but with one word to a person who had not stopped looking. And there is one more thing about that name, which only lands if you know where Mary Magdalene came from. Luke tells us, almost in passing, that she was a woman out of whom 7 devils had gone. Whatever precisely that describes, and the text does not elaborate, It marks her as someone who had been at the far edge of what her society could accommodate. Not a respected witness, not a person whose word would be taken anywhere. That is who is standing in the garden. And that is who is trusted with the message first and sent with it to the men who would go on to lead the church. The order of it is not incidental. The first person to see him is the one with the least standing to be believed, and the instruction given to her is go and tell. Whatever else the morning establishes, it establishes that. They thought somebody had taken the body. He had simply left the wrappings folded.